All right, welcome everyone. This week we are working through kind of two units. We're kind of combining the unemployment rate or unemployment and inflation. These are our last two indicators that we need to work through before we can start modeling this process. But when we're thinking about unemployment rate or calculating the unemployment rate, we need to focus on these first two here. So put a hard line here. The first two are the categories that go into this calculation. And so if we look at our formula, we see our unemployment rate. We take our unemployed individuals, those are people in category 2. They're people who don't have work, but they're actively seeking work at the moment. Those are individuals who are counted in our unemployed section. And we divide that by the total labor force. And the total labor force, this portion in the denominator here, is actually just employed plus unemployed. So it's all of our individuals who are working. And important to note that you don't need to be working full time to be considered in category 1, as long as you're working an hour within that time frame. Within the time frame from whatever survey, whether you're using the payroll survey or the CPS, as long as you're working within there, then you're counted as employed. And as long as you've been actively seeking, you're counted as unemployed. And so we can think about our unemployment rate calculation as just unemployed divided by our employed plus unemployed, and then we just multiply by 100 to get that nice percentage. And so when we're looking at the unemployment rate, this whole category 3, if we look at this section here, this section is not counted in our unemployment rate. So all of these individuals who might be discouraged or maybe haven't sent out application or not actively seeking, they're not considered in this unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is an excellent statistic because it allows us to target policy to try and improve the outcomes for individuals who are actively seeking at the moment. We have a separate policy tool that we can utilize to help people out of the labor force, but our unemployment statistic is specifically important in the context of recessions. And so we'll talk about that one in a second. But I want to juxtapose this formula with the labor force participation rate. And so this one, when we think about our labor force participation rate, we have our total labor force, which again can be written as our employed plus unemployed over our total adult population. And really this is a little more specific. So when we're thinking about all of these individuals, we're thinking about people who are over 16. We're also thinking about individuals below that retirement age. And this also doesn't consider military service members. And so specifically, if we want to get really specific with this, we're talking about the total adult civilian population over 16 there. Now, formulas themselves, they're relatively straightforward. We have our different types of employment that we think about with our cyclical, and this is the most important because our cyclical unemployment, this is the type of unemployment that we target policy towards. So this is when we'll see things, if we think about our examples, you'll see things like stimulus checks that we saw in the Trump administration. This is also, if we think about the 2008 stimulus package, whenever we end up with a severe recession, like the 2008 Great Recession, or we end up with something like the COVID-19 pandemic, we want to respond quickly. Again, when we're looking at this calculation, we're thinking about people who are actively seeking. And so as that number starts to rise, if we think about 10, 12, 13% unemployment, that means 13% of our individuals who don't have a job right now, who are actively looking, can't find jobs. And so in order to get people back on their feet who are actively seeking, we'll really focus policy towards this type of unemployment. When we look at our other categories, like our frictional and structural, we it's not that we don't care about these, but these are like, it's nice to have a little bit of slack in the labor market. Frictional, a lot of these, like one of the examples, you can consider people when all of you graduate with your AA or your bachelor's and you move into the labor market, you'll generally experience a period of frictional unemployment when you're looking for the job that best suits you, your first career path. And so that is the type of unemployment that we would like as people transition from one career to the next. The one that is a little more difficult, but we won't target policy towards, is this structural unemployment. These are situations in which your skills are no longer utilized in the labor market. A lot of times, we might not have very specific policies, but these are when we see something, we see this in the New Deal, but when we might have the creation of job retraining programs. So, in response to something like structural unemployment, we might see that an administration implements job training programs to help individuals whose skills are no longer used in the labor market. And so as we see more and more jobs become more automated and replaced with technology, we might see the creation of new job training programs that can allow those people to continue to work. The trickiest part when it comes to unemployment is this short-run impact. There are a number of different theories, and I want you to work through each of these. Each of these theories are different examples of why we might see this concept. Why we might say that wages might be sticky downwards. And so what does that mean? Like, here's our context. What we have initially is we have an economic boom. So we think about the business cycle here. We have our business cycle, and this figure is illustrating on an upward trend in the business cycle. We're reaching a peak, and in that peak, we experience an increase in demand for labor. In the market for labor, our demand curve is comprised of all of our firms, and our supply curve is comprised of us workers. As we see this increase in demand, that drives up the wage from W0 to W1. We get an increase in our wages because all of these firms want more and more labor. We're in an economic boom, everyone's purchasing goods, and so we need to produce a greater quantity of goods here. And in order to do so, we need to incentivize people to come work for us by offering a higher wage. So, this illustrates the context of a peak. However, once we dip, so our next slide will highlight what happens when we hit this recession or this trough. Recession. So we're hitting this recession and we end up with a decrease in labor. A decrease in demand for labor. Now we hit a recession, no one's buying goods, and so we see firms start laying off workers, and as a result, we should see, with a decrease in demand for labor, in our micro models, we highlight that a decrease in demand for labor should just meet this new equilibrium, and we get a new wage down here at W1. However, what our figure is highlighting here, and what we mean when we say wages are sticky downwards, is that in the context of a recession, we can't drop the wage. It's very difficult to decrease wages for firms. So, wages are sticky, and when wages are sticky, this implies we can't drop the wage, and so we see layoffs. Or, we see involuntary unemployment. And so that's how we end up with this involuntary unemployment in the short run. That's kind of the most difficult concept here, and if you work through these, take your time working through these examples here, but these are all examples of how that process can work, why we might get stuck without cutting wages and just end up cutting our workforce. So take some time, work through that. If you do have any questions, then just stop by during office hours or shoot me an email.